If you're going to destroy this neighborhood, you'll have to look me in the eye while you do it. Those were the first words I ever said to Gideon Vale, and even now, I can't believe my voice didn't shake. The rain had been falling since sundown, turning the cracked pavement of Hawthorne Street into a ribbon of black glass beneath the streetlights. I stood outside the old community center with $11 in my coat pocket, a past-due electric bill folded inside my purse, and shoes so worn that cold water had already soaked through my socks. Across from me, 3 black SUVs idled along the curb, their headlights cut through the rain. Their engines purred quietly, expensive and patient. Everyone on that block knew what those vehicles meant. Gideon Vale had come in person. People had been whispering his name for months. Some called him a businessman, others lowered their voices before saying anything at all. I only knew his companies had purchased half the buildings around us, and by morning, according to the notices taped to our doors, the remaining tenants were supposed to leave. Families, shop owners, people who had lived here for 30 years. Nora Hayes stood behind me beneath the community center awning, clutching her cardigan closed with both hands. Her grocery store was across the street. She had opened it in 1989. The notice on her window said she had 12 hours to surrender the property. "Mara," she whispered, "please don't make this worse." I looked at her, then at the families gathered behind the glass doors. Nobody wanted trouble. Neither did I. But there are moments when fear becomes more expensive than courage. The rear door of the center SUV opened. A man stepped out holding a black umbrella. Then Gideon Vale emerged behind him. He was taller than I expected, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than everything I owned. Rain touched the shoulders before the umbrella covered him. He didn't hurry. Men like Gideon never seemed to hurry, because the world usually waited for them. Another man followed, older, watchful, with calm grey eyes. I would later learn his name was Elliot Mercer. Gideon looked at the building first, then the crowd. Then me. His gaze stopped. Maybe because I was standing directly in the street, maybe because everyone else had moved back. "You need to clear the entrance," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The men around him immediately became still. I swallowed. No. Silence. Even the rain seemed louder after that. Gideon tilted his head slightly, studying me as though I had answered a question incorrectly. "Excuse me. You heard me." My hands were freezing inside my coat pockets, and my heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it beneath my ribs. Courage, I discovered that night, doesn't feel like courage while you're doing it. It feels like terror with nowhere left to go. Gideon took 2 slow steps toward me. "This property has been legally acquired. People aren't property." His expression barely changed, but something in his eyes sharpened. I didn't say they were. Then stop treating them like numbers on a spreadsheet. Someone behind him shifted uncomfortably. Gideon noticed. Of course he did. He seemed like the kind of man who noticed everything. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mara Whitmore." "Do you own this building, Ms. Whitmore?" "No." "Do you own any property on this block?" "No." "Then why are you standing in my way?" That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it told me everything about him. Gideon Vale understood ownership, contracts, leverage. He understood what could be bought and what could be taken away. But apparently, he didn't understand why someone would fight for something that wasn't theirs. I stepped closer, just enough that I no longer had to raise my voice over the rain. Because Mrs. Hayes can't afford another store. Because the Parker family has 3 kids and nowhere to go. Because that building behind me keeps the heat on during winter nights when people can't pay their bills. And because somebody should tell you no before you forget what the word sounds like. Elliot looked down, almost hiding a reaction. Gideon didn't. He stared at me for a long moment. Behind him sat 3 SUVs, men in tailored coats, lawyers, money, influence, every advantage a person could collect. Behind me stood frightened neighbors, a leaking roof, and a community center held together by donated paint and stubbornness. The difference between us should have made me feel small. Somehow, it didn't. Gideon finally spoke. Move. One word. Calm. Final. I could hear Nora quietly saying my name behind me. I could feel the rain running down the back of my neck. I thought about the $11 in my pocket. about how easily a man like Gideon could change my entire life without even remembering he'd done it. Then I looked directly into his eyes. No. For the first time that night, Gideon Vale looked surprised. Not angry. Not yet. Surprised. As if the city had spent so many years stepping aside that he'd forgotten someone could simply remain standing. He moved closer, until only a few feet separated us. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. I held his gaze. "That's exactly why I'm standing here." For 3 full seconds, Gideon Vale said nothing. He just watched me through the rain, and somehow that silence felt heavier than anger. Then he turned his head toward Elliot Mercer. "Give them until tomorrow night." Elliot glanced at me, then back at Gideon. 24 hours? 24. The words moved through the crowd like cold air. Behind me, someone whispered a prayer. Nora Hayes gripped my sleeve. I wanted to argue, but Gideon was already walking toward his SUV. "That is not enough time," I called after him. He stopped without turning around. "It is more time than you had 5 minutes ago." Then he got into the vehicle, and the convoy disappeared down Hawthorne Street, leaving nothing behind but red taillights reflected in the wet pavement. For a moment, nobody moved. Then everyone started talking at once. Some thanked me, others blamed me for making Gideon notice us. I understood both reactions. By midnight, I was inside the community center, helping families sort paperwork, calling housing offices, churches, legal clinics, anyone who might listen. Most calls went unanswered. The ones that did not offered sympathy instead of solutions. Around 2 in the morning, Nora placed a paper cup of coffee beside me. "You should go home." I stared at the list of names spread across the folding table. "Home is 2 blocks from here." "Exactly." I looked at her tired face. "I am not leaving you here alone." Morning arrived grey and exhausted. By 10, a black sedan stopped outside. Elliot Mercer stepped out carrying a slim leather folder. He entered alone. "Ms. Whitmore, if that is another notice, you can save the paper." His expression almost softened. "Mr. Vale asked me to deliver an offer." He placed the folder on the table. Inside was a check. I stared at the number twice because the first time my brain refused to accept it. $50,000. More money than I had ever seen attached to my name. Enough to clear my debts. Enough for a better apartment. Enough to leave Hawthorne Street before the lights were shut off and the doors were locked. "What is this?" I asked. "Relocation assistance." "For everyone." Elliot hesitated. "That was my answer. For you." I pushed the folder back. "No. Ms. Whitmore, think carefully. I am. Mr. Vale is offering you an opportunity. He is offering me a price." Elliot studied me for a moment, then took out his phone. He expected this. 15 minutes later, another black SUV arrived. Gideon stepped inside the community center, as if he owned the building already. Everyone went quiet. He walked straight to the table. 100,000. I blinked. "Excuse me." The offer. $100,000. You leave today, and this ends. My stomach tightened. I thought about my electric bill. My empty refrigerator. The collection notices hidden in a drawer, because sometimes unopened envelopes felt less real. Gideon saw something in my face. "That amount changes your life." "Maybe." "Then take it." I closed the folder and slid it toward him. "No." His eyes narrowed. "Everyone has a price." "Then you finally met someone you cannot afford." The room became perfectly still. Gideon looked at me as if I were a puzzle that had started insulting him. "You would choose poverty over common sense." "I would choose being able to look at myself tomorrow morning." Something changed in his expression. Small, almost invisible. Then Elliot stepped beside him and murmured something too quietly for me to hear. Gideon nodded once. 24 hours, Ms. Whitmore. Do not confuse patience with surrender." He left. I waited until the vehicles were gone before allowing myself to breathe normally again. That afternoon, I walked 3 blocks to the municipal records office, hoping to find something useful about the property sale. The main desk was closed for lunch, so I waited near a side hallway. That was when I heard voices behind a partially open conference room door. One belonged to a city official I recognized from television. The other was colder, sharper. "Vale thinks the families are leaving voluntarily," the stranger said. "Keep it that way." "And if they challenge the permits?" the official asked. "They will not." The records disappear tonight. My breath caught. I moved closer without thinking. Through the narrow opening, I saw a tall man in a dark coat hand the official a folder. Later I would learn his name was Ronan Blackwell. At that moment, all I knew was that Gideon Vale might not understand what was being done in his name. I stepped backward. My shoe scraped the tile. The conversation stopped. The door opened. Ronan looked directly at me and smiled without warmth. "Well," he said quietly, "you must be Mara Whitmore." "I was wondering when you would become a problem," Ronan Blackwell said, and the calmness in his voice frightened me more than anger would have. I stood in the municipal hallway with one hand still resting against the cold wall, trying to slow my breathing while the city official behind him suddenly became very interested in the papers on the conference table. Ronan stepped into the hallway and gently pulled the door closed behind him. He looked polished, almost ordinary, dark wool coat, silver tie, expensive watch, the kind of man who could sit beside you at a charity dinner and never give you a reason to remember his face. "I do not know what you mean," I said. "Of course you do," he smiled. "You heard something you were not supposed to hear." My mouth went dry. I was waiting for the records office. "Then you should have kept waiting." He moved closer, not threatening me, not touching me, just lowering his voice until the hallway seemed suddenly too narrow. "Hawthorne Street is already settled. The paperwork is done. The families will leave. Gideon will get what he wants. Everybody moves on. Gideon knows you are changing records." That made his smile disappear, only for a second. But I saw it. "You are asking dangerous questions, Ms. Whitmore." I asked a simple one. His eyes hardened. "Go home. Not until I see those files." "There are no files for you to see." "Then you should not be worried." For one strange moment, neither of us spoke. Somewhere downstairs, a printer started humming. A phone rang behind a closed office door. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. They made the conversation feel even more unreal. Ronan finally stepped aside. "You really think courage makes you powerful?" "No," I said. "I think people like you depend on everyone else being afraid." I walked away before my knees could betray me. I made it outside, crossed the sidewalk, and had taken maybe 10 steps when a familiar black SUV pulled to the curb. Elliot Mercer got out first. His expression changed when he saw my face. "What happened?" asked Ronan Blackwell. Elliot went still. That told me enough. The rear door opened. Gideon Vale sat inside, one hand resting against the dark leather seat. "Get in." I almost laughed. "You people really need to learn how invitations work." "Mara," his voice was sharper this time. "Get in." "No." Elliot looked toward the building, then back at me. "This is not the place." Something in his tone changed my mind. I climbed into the SUV, but only because suddenly I wanted answers more than I wanted distance. Gideon sat across from me. The vehicle smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Outside, the city moved past rain-streaked windows. "What did you hear?" he asked. I told him. Every word. The missing records. The permits. Ronan saying the families would leave whether they agreed or not. Gideon listened without interrupting. His face became unreadable. "You expect me to believe Ronan is acting behind my back? I do not care what you believe." His eyes lifted to mine. "That is becoming obvious. You wanted Hawthorne Street. Maybe you never asked how people were making that happen." Silence. That landed somewhere deeper than I expected. Gideon looked toward Elliot. "Take us home." I turned toward him. "Home? My house? Absolutely not. Ronan knows you heard him. That is his problem." "No." Gideon leaned forward slightly. "Now it is mine." 20 minutes later, iron gates opened onto a property so large it looked unreal. Stone walls, tall windows, acres of dark lawn disappearing beyond the headlights. When the SUV stopped, I stayed seated. "You cannot keep me here," I said. "I am keeping you somewhere Ronan cannot reach you without answering to me." "That sounds a lot like keeping me here." Gideon exhaled slowly. "Call it whatever makes you feel better." Inside, the house was quieter than any place that expensive had a right to be. Marble floors reflected soft golden light. A woman carrying a tray hurried across the entryway, caught the edge of a rug, and nearly dropped a glass. Gideon's voice cut through the silence. "Careful." She froze immediately. I saw the fear before she lowered her eyes. I bent down and steadied the tray with her. "You are fine," I told her. She whispered thanks and disappeared down the hall. When I stood, Gideon was watching me. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. You clearly have something to say." I looked around his enormous house, at Elliot waiting silently near the doorway, at the staff who seemed to measure every breath around him. Then I looked back at Gideon. People obey you because they are afraid of what happens if they do not. His jaw tightened. It works. I held his gaze. Until it does not, I should have kept quiet after that. Any sensible person would have. Instead, I stood in the middle of Gideon Vale's marble foyer, dripping rainwater onto a rug that probably cost more than my yearly income, and waited for him to prove me wrong. He did not. He only looked at me with that unreadable expression of his, then told Elliot to have a room prepared upstairs. "I am not staying long," I said. Gideon removed his coat and handed it to a member of the staff without looking away from me. "Neither of us knows that yet." I hated how calm he sounded. "Look, you really do believe you can control everything." "Not everything." His gaze held mine for half a second longer. Just enough. I was shown to a guest room larger than my entire apartment, with windows overlooking a stretch of lawn disappearing into darkness. Fresh clothes had been placed on the bed. My size. That bothered me more than it should have. By midnight, I still could not sleep. The house was too quiet. No traffic through thin walls, no radiator knocking, no voices from neighboring apartments, just the soft ticking of an antique clock somewhere in the hall. I finally gave up and wandered downstairs. A light was on beneath a door near the back of the house. I found Gideon inside a study lined with books and old photographs. He was standing beside the fireplace, jacket gone, tie loosened, staring at a framed picture in his hand. He looked almost normal until he noticed me. Then the walls went back up. "You should be asleep. You should stop telling me what I should do." To my surprise, one corner of his mouth moved. Barely. I walked toward the shelves and noticed a photograph of Hawthorne Street. Not the Hawthorne Street I knew. This one looked decades younger. Children sat on apartment steps. Storefront awnings stretched over the sidewalk. A boy stood beside a woman outside Nora's grocery store. I looked closer. The boy had Gideon's eyes. "That is you." His expression changed. "Put it down." I had not realized I was holding the frame. I returned it carefully. "You grew up there." He said nothing. "You are tearing down the neighborhood you came from. You do not know what you are talking about." "Then tell me." Gideon turned toward the window. For several seconds, only the clock spoke. "My mother worked 2 jobs," he finally said. "Cleaning offices at night, serving breakfast in the morning. My father borrowed money from people he should not have trusted. When everything collapsed, nobody cared why." His voice stayed flat, but I could hear the effort behind that flatness. "We lost the apartment. My mother spent months moving us between relatives, cheap motels, anywhere that would take us." I looked back at the photograph. Suddenly the polished floors and guarded gates made a terrible kind of sense. "So you decided nobody would ever take anything from you again?" He looked at me. "I decided never to be powerless again. And now you are doing to other families exactly what happened to yours." The silence afterward was brutal. Gideon's face hardened. "Be careful." "Why?" "Because the truth sounds disrespectful when nobody usually says it to you." He stepped away from the window. "You think poverty makes people noble?" "No. Poverty makes people tired." My voice softened despite myself. "It makes people choose between groceries and electricity. It makes a $5 mistake feel like a disaster. It makes you lie awake wondering what disappears next. I know exactly what it does." His eyes shifted to my coat hanging over a chair, still damp from the rain. $11, he said. I froze. "What?" "That is what you had in your pocket yesterday." Anger flashed through me. "You searched my things?" "No. Elliot noticed when you paid for coffee at the community center." I stared at him. "That is somehow worse." "Why?" "Because it means you pay attention to things you pretend not to care about." That landed. He looked away first. Then the lights suddenly flickered and went out. The room fell dark except for the fireplace, and a few emergency lights glowing faintly in the hallway. For the first time since I met him, Gideon Vale did not look like the man who controlled an entire city. He looked like the boy in the photograph, alone, guarded, still trying to build enough walls to make sure nothing could ever be taken from him again. "What was her name?" I asked quietly. He knew who I meant. Evelyn, your mother, he nodded. She would have hated this house. I almost smiled. Why? Gideon looked around at the dark wood, the expensive furniture, the silence. She said a home should sound lived in. Something in my chest tightened. She sounds smart. She was. The fire shifted softly. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then I asked the question I had been holding since Hawthorne Street. When did being safe become the same thing as making everyone else afraid? Gideon looked at me across the dim room. This time, he did not warn me. He did not dismiss me. He did not tell me to leave. He simply stood there in the quiet, and for the first time, I realized I had found something Gideon Vale did not know how to control. His own answer. By morning, Gideon had an answer for me, but it was not the one I expected. You are coming with me. I looked up from the coffee someone had placed in front of me at the kitchen island. That sounds suspiciously like another order. It is. Then my answer is still no. Gideon stood across from me in a dark suit, perfectly composed again, as if the man I had spoken with beside the fireplace had disappeared with the night. There is a meeting downtown. Property owners. Investors, city representatives. And why would I be there? Because you keep insisting I do not understand what I am doing. His gaze settled on mine. Show me. 2 hours later, I walked into a conference room, 40 floors above the city, wearing the same clothes I had arrived in. Around me sat men and women in tailored suits, polished shoes, watches that probably cost more than Nora Hayes had earned last year. A wall of glass revealed the skyline beneath us. Hawthorne Street was somewhere down there, too small to see. That felt appropriate. Places like ours always looked insignificant from rooms like this. Elliot stood near the door. Ronan Blackwell sat halfway down the table, his expression smooth and professional. The moment he saw me, something cold passed through his eyes. Gideon took the chair at the head of the table. I remained standing. Sit, he said. I am comfortable. Ronan gave a quiet laugh. This is a business meeting, Gideon, not a neighborhood hearing. Gideon did not look at him. She stays. The meeting began. Numbers filled the screen. Acquisition costs, projected revenue, development schedules, temporary relocation statistics. Temporary. That word appeared 3 times. Nobody mentioned Nora. Nobody mentioned the Parkers. Nobody mentioned the elderly man in apartment 14 who kept his late wife's photograph beside his front door because she had been the one who chose that apartment 52 years earlier. They spoke about people as units, blocks, obstacles. I lasted 23 minutes. Then a developer said, the remaining residents represent less than 4% of the total project footprint. I stood. Every head turned toward me. Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly. Mara, no, you wanted me here. So listen. Ronan leaned back in his chair. This should be entertaining. I ignored him. My hands were trembling, but I opened the notebook I had carried from the community center. Nora Hayes, 63 years old. She opened her grocery store in 1989 with money she borrowed from her sister. She knows which kids need lunch even when their parents cannot pay. She lets people settle their tabs on payday. Silence replaced the clicking keyboards. The Parker family. 3 children. Their youngest has asthma. They live 4 blocks from the clinic because they do not own a car. Mr. Walter Green, 78. He has lived in the same apartment since 1974. One of the investors cleared his throat. Ms. Whitmore, with respect, we cannot structure a development plan around individual anecdotes. That is convenient. His expression tightened. Excuse me? You call them anecdotes because saying their names makes the math uncomfortable. I turned toward Gideon. He had not moved. You keep calling this progress. You keep calling it an empire. But an empire built by making ordinary people smaller is not strength. Ronan pushed his chair back. That is enough. Gideon's eyes shifted to him. I decide when it is enough. The room went still. I looked at Gideon and finished what I had come to say. Your mother lost her home because powerful people looked at a number and decided her life was less important than theirs. His face changed. Barely, but I saw it. Mara, Elliot said softly, warning me. I kept going. Now you are sitting at the other end of the same table. No one breathed. Gideon looked down at the financial projections in front of him. then toward the enormous windows overlooking the city. 10 seconds passed. 20. Ronan finally spoke. "We have signatures waiting. Delaying this costs us millions." Gideon turned back to the table. "Then we lose millions." Ronan stared at him. "What?" "The Hawthorne acquisition is suspended." Several people began talking at once. Gideon raised one hand, and silence returned instantly. "No relocation, no demolition, no transfers until every agreement is reviewed personally by Elliot." Ronan stood. "You cannot dismantle months of work because a woman walked in here with a notebook." Gideon's voice became very quiet. "Sit down, Ronan." He did. I stared at Gideon, unable to speak. He closed the folder in front of him. Meeting over. Chairs moved. Papers disappeared into briefcases. People filed toward the doors without looking at me. Ronan passed close enough to meet my eyes, but said nothing. When only Gideon, Elliot, and I remained, I finally found my voice. "Why did you do that?" Gideon looked toward the empty chairs. "Because I heard their names." "That cannot be the whole reason." His eyes returned to mine. "No." The city stretched behind him, enormous and glittering. For once, he did not look like a man standing above it. He looked like someone seeing the distance for the first time. "You were right about something," he said. "Which thing?" A faint shadow of irritation crossed his face. "Do not enjoy this." I almost smiled. Too late. He looked away, but not before I saw something I had never seen in Gideon Vale before. Doubt. And somehow, that frightened Ronan Blackwell far more than my defiance ever could. The first thing Gideon changed was not the money, it was the rules. By the end of that week, Elliot had reviewed every Hawthorne Street agreement and found enough irregularities to keep 3 attorneys working past midnight. Families who had been pressured into leaving were given new options. Small businesses received extensions. Nobody was allowed to approach a resident without written terms and independent review. Gideon did not announce any of it. He simply started giving different orders. I noticed because Hawthorne Street felt different. Nora reopened her store the next morning and placed a handwritten sign in the window that said, "Still here." The Parker children drew flowers around it with colored markers. For the first time in days, people laughed outside the community center. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I kept wondering why Gideon had disappeared. 3 days passed without seeing him. Then, late Thursday afternoon, his SUV stopped across from Nora's store. Gideon stepped out alone. No umbrella, no visible security, just a dark coat and that same controlled expression. Nora nearly dropped a carton of milk when he walked inside. "Relax," I whispered to her. "Easy for you to say," she whispered back. Gideon heard her. I knew because one corner of his mouth tightened. He walked toward me and placed a folder on the counter. New lease protections. I opened it. For everyone affected by the acquisition. I looked through the pages. There were guarantees against forced relocation, rent increases capped for existing tenants, and compensation requirements that would have sounded impossible 1 week earlier. "You actually did it. You sound surprised." "I am." "You are terrible at compliments." "That was not a compliment." He almost smiled. That was becoming dangerous in a completely different way. Not because there was anything romantic about the moment. Because every time Gideon acted like a human being instead of a title, it became harder to reduce him to the man I had first met in the rain. We walked outside. Evening light stretched across Hawthorne Street, turning old brick buildings gold. Children bounced a basketball near the community center. A delivery truck blocked half the lane. Someone upstairs played music too loudly through an open window. Gideon watched everything without speaking. "You remember it differently," I said. "Smaller." "You were smaller." He glanced at me. That was almost insightful. "Careful. You might start respecting me." His expression changed. "I already do." I stopped walking. He did not. It took him several steps to realize I was no longer beside him. Gideon turned. "What?" "Nothing." "That is becoming your least convincing word." I caught up with him. "Respect is not the same thing as listening when I am standing in front of you." "I know." "Good. You always have another condition." "Yes." We reached the community center steps. Elliot was waiting near the SUV now, speaking quietly on his phone. Across the street, 2 men I recognized from the downtown meeting stood beside another car. They watched Gideon with expressions I did not like. "Your changes are making people nervous," I said. "People become nervous when money moves." "Is that all this is?" Gideon followed my gaze. "No." His answer came too quickly. "Ronan?" He looked at me. "You need to stay away from him. That is not an answer. It is the only one you need." There it was again. The order. The wall. I folded my arms. You cannot change half the system and still expect everyone around you to obey without questions. His jaw tightened. "This is not Hawthorne Street politics, Mara." "Exactly. It is bigger, which means your choices matter more." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I am trying to keep you outside something you do not understand. And I am trying to tell you that protecting me does not mean controlling me." Silence settled between us. The basketball bounced behind me. Once, twice. Gideon's eyes moved toward the kids, then back to me. "You think every decision I make is about control. Most of them are. That is how people survive in my world. Maybe that is the problem." He looked tired suddenly. "Not physically, something deeper. What do you want from me?" he asked. The question surprised me, because there was no irritation in it. I thought about the conference room, his mother, Nora's store, the rules he had already changed. Then I gave him the answer I knew he would hate. "I do not want the version of you that becomes decent only when I am watching." His face went completely still. I continued before I lost my nerve. "If you protect one neighborhood because I embarrassed you in a meeting, nothing really changed. If you stop Ronan only because he frightened me, nothing changed. If you treat people better because you want me to think better of you, then the moment I disappear, everything goes back to the way it was." Gideon looked past me toward Hawthorne Street. "You think I am doing this for you? Are you?" He did not answer. That was answer enough. I stepped closer. "Do it because you finally understand it is right." For once, Gideon had no sharp response. Elliot ended his call and approached us, his face unusually serious. "Gideon." Something in his voice changed the air. Gideon turned. "What happened?" Elliot hesitated, then looked briefly at me. "3 of our partners are threatening to pull out. Ronan has been meeting with them privately." Gideon's expression hardened. "Since when?" "Since the Hawthorne suspension." I felt cold despite the mild evening. Elliot lowered his voice. "They think Mara has too much influence over you." Gideon looked at me. I expected anger. Instead, I saw something closer to concern. "And what do you think?" he asked Elliot. Elliot was silent for a moment. "I think they are afraid she is changing the way you think." Gideon's eyes stayed on mine. "That," he said quietly, "is what worries me too." The accusation came 2 days later, and Ronan made sure Gideon heard it in front of everyone. I was called to Gideon's downtown office just after 6 in the evening. After spending most of the day helping Nora sort supplier invoices and answering questions from families who still did not trust the new lease protections. Elliot had sounded different on the phone, too formal, too careful. When I arrived, the conference room was already full. Gideon sat at the head of the table. Elliot stood near the windows. Ronan was on the opposite side, with 3 of the partners who had threatened to leave. Nobody offered me a chair. "What is this?" I asked. Gideon's eyes stayed on mine. "Sit down, Mara." "I would rather stand." Ronan gave a small smile. "Of course you would." Gideon ignored him. A folder rested in front of him. He opened it and turned several pages toward me. Printed emails, financial summaries, copies of internal schedules. At the top of one page was my name. My stomach tightened. "What am I looking at?" "Documents sent to a city investigator yesterday morning," Gideon said. His voice was flat. "They came from an account connected to the community center." I looked at him. "And you think I sent them?" Ronan leaned forward. "Someone did. I was at Nora's store yesterday morning." "You had access to the office computers," he said. "So did 12 volunteers. Only one of them has been asking questions about Gideon's business." I turned toward him. "You really want to talk about people asking questions?" His smile disappeared. Gideon closed the folder. Enough. The room obeyed him instantly. That was the old Gideon. One word, and everyone stopped. Except me. "Did you bring me here to ask what happened, or did you bring me here because you already decided?" His expression hardened. I brought you here because the information came from somewhere close to you. That is not what I asked. Elliot shifted near the window. Gideon's fingers rested against the folder. Did you send these files? No. The answer came easily, because it was true. Gideon watched me. 5 seconds. Maybe more. I could hear the low hum of the building's air conditioning. The city outside the windows looked distant and cold. That is it? He asked. I almost did not understand. What else do you want? An explanation. For something I did not do. For why your name is connected to it. I felt something inside me sink. Not fear. Disappointment. It was worse. I do not have one. Ronan exhaled, as if that settled everything. Convenient. I turned toward Gideon, not Ronan. Do you believe me? He did not answer immediately. That pause hurt more than I expected. I thought about the dark study. His mother's photograph. Hawthorne Street. The meeting where he stopped everything, because I made him hear the names behind the numbers. I thought respect had started growing between us. Maybe I had been wrong. Mara, he said carefully, I need facts. You have one. His brow tightened. What? My word. Silence. Ronan looked almost pleased. Gideon did not. That is not enough in my world. My chest went cold. Then maybe your world has not changed as much as I thought. Elliot looked down. Gideon's jaw tightened. Do not turn this into something it is not. What is it then? I asked. Because from where I am standing, one folder with my name on it mattered more than everything you already know about me. I am trying to protect what I built. There it is. There is what? The part you still worship. His eyes flashed. Be careful. No. My voice shook this time, but I did not lower it. You wanted me to tell you the truth when nobody else would. So here it is. You say you respect me, but the first time trusting me costs you something. You reach for suspicion instead. Nobody at the table moved. I could feel Ronan watching us, but I did not care anymore. Gideon stood slowly. I asked you a question. And I answered it. Then help me understand. If my word means nothing to you, nothing else I say will matter. That stopped him. For 1 second, I saw the man from the dark study again. Not the boss, not the man everyone feared. Just Gideon. But I was too hurt to stay and wait for him to decide which version of himself would win. I picked up my coat. Elliot stepped away from the window. Mara, do not. Gideon came around the table. Where are you going? I looked at him. Home. You are not leaving until this is settled. The old command. The old instinct. Control first. Trust later. I felt strangely calm. Watch me. The room became silent. Nobody walked away from Gideon Vale. Everyone in that room knew it. So did I. I reached the door and waited for the order that would stop me. It never came. I looked back once. Gideon stood beside the table, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. Ronan was watching him now, not me. That was when I understood something important. Gideon letting me leave was not weakness. It was the first time he had chosen not to use power simply because he had it. I stepped into the hallway. The elevator doors opened. Just before they closed, I heard Elliot's voice behind me. Gideon, the timestamps do not match. The doors slid shut before I heard the answer, and for the first time since meeting Gideon Vale, I walked away without knowing whether he would come after me. I did not hear from Gideon that night. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. I went back to my apartment, set my keys on the chipped kitchen counter, and stared at the overdue electric bill beneath them, as if my old problems could somehow make the new ones disappear. They did not. At 11:47, Nora called to make sure I was home. At midnight, I checked my phone. Nothing. At 1:15, I told myself I was relieved. At 2, I stopped pretending. The next morning, Hawthorne Street was quiet beneath a pale grey sky. I walked to the community centre and found Elliot waiting outside. No SUV, no entourage. Just Elliot, with 2 cups of coffee and exhaustion written across his face. You were right, he said. I took the coffee, but said nothing. The account was created using credentials copied from the centre weeks ago. The messages were scheduled remotely. Ronan had access to the acquisition files, the city contacts, all of it. My stomach tightened. Does Gideon know? Elliot gave me a tired look. He knows more than that now. We sat on the centre steps. Elliot told me what they had found. Ronan had been quietly manipulating property deals for years, adding pressure Gideon had never authorized, hiding payments inside legitimate expenses, convincing partners that fear was more profitable than negotiation. My first instinct was satisfaction. I had known something was wrong. Then Elliot said something that erased it. Gideon is not blaming Ronan for everything. I looked at him. What does that mean? It means he finally understands Ronan could only do those things because Gideon built a system where nobody questioned orders. The coffee suddenly felt too hot in my hands. Elliot stared across the street at Nora's store. He spent his life believing loyalty meant silence. Ronan understood that better than anyone. Where is Gideon? Elliot hesitated. Ending it. By noon, rumors were moving through the neighborhood. Development offices had closed. Contracts were being frozen. Several partnerships had been dissolved. By 3, one local news station reported that Vale Holdings had withdrawn from multiple redevelopment projects across the city. Nobody understood why. I did. Gideon was tearing apart the machine that had made him untouchable. I wanted to call him, I did not. Some choices had to belong to him. That evening, Elliot finally sent one message asking me to come downtown. When I arrived, the same conference room from the night before looked completely different. Half the chairs were empty. Documents covered the table. Ronan stood near the windows with his coat over one arm, his polished confidence finally cracked. Gideon stood at the head of the table. He looked exhausted. "You cannot do this," Ronan said. "We built this together." Gideon's voice stayed quiet. "That is exactly why I can. You are throwing away millions." "Yes." Ronan stared at him. "For her." Gideon's eyes moved to me. For a second, nobody spoke. Then he looked back at Ronan. "No." Something inside me tightened. Gideon continued. "That is the part I should have understood sooner. I am doing it because it should never have been built this way." Ronan laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You think changing a few contracts makes you a good man?" "No." Gideon closed the folder in front of him. "It makes today different from yesterday. Tomorrow is another decision." Elliot placed another document on the table. Gideon signed it. Then another. Each signature closed something: predatory acquisitions, forced relocation agreements, partnerships based on intimidation. I watched years of power disappear beneath the movement of a pen. Ronan looked around the room as if waiting for someone to stop it. Nobody did. Finally, Gideon faced him. "Your position is terminated. Elliot will handle the legal transition. You will communicate through counsel from this point forward." Ronan looked at me before leaving. For once, I saw no victory in his expression, only disbelief. The door closed behind him. Gideon remained standing. "How much?" I asked quietly. "How much what?" "How much did you lose today?" Elliot glanced at Gideon. Gideon answered without hesitation. "Enough. That is not a number." "You would hate the number." I almost smiled, but the feeling disappeared when I saw how tired he looked. "Why did you not call me?" He lowered his eyes for a moment. "Because you told me not to become decent only when you were watching." I had no answer to that. He walked toward the windows. Evening lights were appearing across the city one by one. "I spent years thinking control protected me," he said. "If nobody questioned me, nobody could undermine me. If everybody feared disappointing me, nothing could fall apart." He looked back at the empty conference table. "I created the exact conditions Ronan needed. I moved closer, stopping several feet away. You trusted the wrong person." "No," his voice was quiet. "I trusted the wrong idea." That was the Gideon I had been waiting to meet. Not a perfect man, not a rescued man, a man finally willing to name his own failure without hiding behind someone else's betrayal. "What happens now?" I asked. He looked at me. "I rebuild what deserves rebuilding." "And the rest?" His eyes moved across the city. I let it fall. For years, Gideon Vale had measured strength by how much he could hold. That night, I watched him discover another kind of power, the courage to open his hands. 3 weeks later, Hawthorne Street sounded like itself again. Delivery trucks complained at the curb, children argued over a basketball near the community center. Nora Hayes stood behind her register, telling everyone who entered that the tomatoes were cheaper 2 blocks away, but hers tasted better. Nothing about the neighborhood looked miraculous. That was what made it feel like one. The buildings were still old. The sidewalks were still cracked. My electric bill was still waiting on the kitchen counter. But nobody was packing boxes, because a deadline had appeared on a door. Nobody was wondering which official had already decided their future. Gideon's name was still everywhere, but differently now. Vale Holdings had converted several disputed properties into protected community leases. A neighborhood preservation fund had been established with independent oversight. Elliot insisted on the independent part. I suspected that was because he had learned exactly what happened when too much authority collected around one person. Gideon had agreed. That surprised me almost as much as everything else. I had not seen him since the night he dismantled the worst parts of his own operation. We had spoken twice. Both conversations lasted less than 5 minutes. No commands, no arguments, no dramatic promises, just updates. Maybe that was healthier. Maybe it was also why I missed him. I was carrying a box of donated books into the community center when Nora appeared behind me. "Your expensive problem is outside." I nearly dropped the box. "My what?" She pointed through the front window. Across the street sat one black sedan, not 3 SUVs, no line of men in dark coats. Gideon stood beside the car alone, holding a large envelope. "He is not my problem." Nora gave me a look. Only women over 60 can give without speaking. Of course not. I left the box on the front desk and stepped outside. The afternoon was cold but bright, the kind of winter day when the sky looked impossibly clear. Gideon watched me cross the street. He looked different without an audience. Still controlled, still sharp, but quieter somehow. "You came without Elliot," I said. "He said I should learn to do some things myself. I like him more every week." I was afraid of that. I stopped a few feet away. "What is in the envelope?" Gideon held it out. The final documents for the preservation fund. I opened it carefully. Hawthorne Street Community Trust. The name looked strange on official paper. I read the first page, then the second. "You transferred the properties, most of them, to the trust." "Yes. And who controls the trust?" "A board." I looked at him suspiciously. "Who is on the board?" "Nora, 2 residents, a local attorney, a housing advocate. Elliot helped establish the safeguards." "And you?" "No." That single word stopped me. Gideon glanced toward the community center. "I donated the assets. I do not control what happens afterward." I looked back at the papers. A month earlier, this man had believed ownership was the answer to every problem. Now he was standing beside me, explaining why he had surrendered it. "That must have hurt," I said. "Financially? Emotionally." His expression softened. "More than financially." I closed the envelope. "So what happens to Gideon Vale now?" He looked down Hawthorne Street. Nora was helping a customer carry groceries. The Parker kids were drawing something with chalk near the curb. An old man was sweeping the sidewalk in front of his building, even though the wind kept undoing his work. Gideon watched them for a long moment. "I find out who I am without everyone being afraid of me." There was no performance in his voice, no clever line waiting behind the words, just uncertainty. I had never heard uncertainty from Gideon before. "That sounds difficult." "It is." "Good." He looked at me. "Good? You have had enough easy answers." A quiet laugh escaped him. It startled both of us. Then silence returned, but it was not the uncomfortable silence from his mansion, or the heavy silence of a conference room waiting for his decision. This one felt open. He glanced at the envelope in my hands. "There is something else." "Of course there is. I owe you an apology." I waited. Gideon did not look away. "I should have believed you when you said you did not send those documents. I treated trust like something you had to prove repeatedly, while expecting everyone else to give it to me automatically." I felt my throat tighten. "That is surprisingly self-aware. Elliot has been unbearable." I smiled, despite myself. Gideon's expression grew serious again. "I am sorry, Mara. I believed him. Maybe because he did not ask me to forgive him. Maybe because he finally understood that an apology was not another kind of transaction." "Thank you," I said. He nodded once. Then he reached for the car door. I frowned. "That is it." Gideon paused. "What were you expecting?" "I do not know. You usually have an order." His eyes held mine. "I am trying something different." "Which is?" "Leaving you a choice." Something shifted inside me. "About what?" He looked almost uncomfortable now, which might have been the strangest thing I had ever seen. "About whether you want me in your life." the old Gideon would have decided for both of us. He would have offered money, protection, certainty, anything except freedom. This man stood quietly and waited. "You are not going to tell me what I should choose?" I asked. "No." "You are not going to make some impossible promise?" "No." "You are really terrible at this." "I know." I laughed. Then I stepped closer. Not because he pulled me, not because I owed him, not because he had saved the neighborhood. I stepped closer because, for the first time since meeting Gideon Vale, there was nothing standing between us except a choice that belonged entirely to me. "Coffee," I said. His brow lifted. "Coffee. Nora makes terrible coffee in the back room. You can buy me one. I thought you had $11. I have 14 now." The faintest smile crossed his face. Impressive. We walked toward the community center together. Nobody moved aside for him. Nobody needed to. Gideon opened the door and waited for me to enter first. It was such a small thing that most people would never have noticed it. I did. He had spent years teaching a city to fear him because he thought fear was proof of power. In the end, losing control did not destroy him. It gave him the chance to become someone worth choosing.